Well, welcome back to another episode. This time it's the Porsche Macan, and it's an interesting one, this one, because there's 3 generations of vehicle here, but all in the same body shell, which is a real rarity. I'm trying to think actually if there's another car like this. There's certainly cars that have had sort of minor facelifts that have sort of carried them on. Volvo XC90 is a good example of a car that sort of got a couple of facelifts. The Macan, though, technically, the way Porsche have viewed it is 3 separate generations, or that's the best way to put it anyway. They've put it as like an E1, E2, E3. Some people sort of just say first facelift, second facelift, but there are actually some quite big changes that happen through the generations. So let's start off. Let's talk about the first generation. These would have come into your market in around 2014. For some of you, it may have been 2015. Depends where you are in the world. What's really interesting is of all the generations of Macan, this is the one with the most choice. So that does happen quite often, that as cars go through their years, there's more choice in particular points, especially if there's diesel variations and then variations of those variations. And I find it a lot on cars that were made between sort of 2010 to about 2018, where there's then sort of hybrid versions, turbo versions, diesel versions, supercharged versions. Clearly, manufacturers were trying a lot of different things. But on the Macan, it's not for that reason. It's just they clearly can identify that certain markets are going to want certain engines, while others are going to be a bit more willing to have big engine, big power, less fuel efficiency. Others, they want their fuel efficiency and they want their power. A little bit of cake and cherry on top. So, what's the one that I would recommend to start with? You know, it's not even a case of my recommendation. It's a case of looking at the sales data. And what's fascinating for me is you'd think, now, if you're in the US, this first little bit won't apply to you, that the 2-litre turbocharged engine just would not be popular. That comes in later for a lot of the world. But for Europe, there's those sold from pretty much the sort of first real year of sales. And they're popular. Now, there is a little bit of difference that goes on here. They're popular with some people because A, they're the cheapest model. B, they give a really good option to people who didn't want a diesel. And Macans, when they came out with a diesel, it sort of was a little bit of a mixed view of them. They weren't as big as the Cayenne. And so there was a little bit of people who could kind of accept the slightly worse fuel economy over, say, a saloon car, but they didn't have to go to a diesel, which became sort of like the mandatory option for a lot of people, especially in Europe, once you went to a larger SUV. However, Macan diesel sales were very, very good. But you would think, especially in these early years, and because the Macan S Diesel is a really, really good drive, you'd think the 4-cylinders would just be ignored, but it isn't. And actually, having driven them and having sort of been able to see a few different specifications, you can get on these early ones. If you look around, I'd say about 2015 is the year, and mainly 15 because after that, diesel sales are pretty dominant throughout, and the S model does get a lot of attention. And certainly from company buyers, the diesel S is the one to go that was chosen. Whereas the 2-litre petrol was more of a private buyer car, and that is where for you on the used market, if you're looking at one of these early ones, that's where there's a real advantage, because a lot of private sales will select optional extras that sometimes don't get added on when they're sort of company lease cars, because a lot of the time they're already built, they're already waiting somewhere, and the option really is just to pick the colour that you want. So if you want to have a look around and you want something a bit competitive, try and find something low owner, I'd say 2 owner, on those 2-litre turbocharged engines. They're still good engines, they're EA 888s, pretty reliable, and the one advantage going forward with having that engine is that you can go to a Volkswagen specialist, you can go to your sort of local garage, or you can go to a Porsche specialist. All of them will be able to sort of deal with the engine. From the suspension side and the frame side, I would always just go with a specialist or a dealer. But if you sort of have a noise one day, you can just run it into the local garage and they'll be very, very familiar with that 2-litre engine. Now, there is the diesel option. I appreciate not all of you get the diesel option, but they did bring it to a lot of markets, and it really made an argument for itself. Unfortunately, its sales are cut short. We know what happens with sort of the Volkswagen emissions scandal, everything else. But it's pushed out there, Macan S Diesel, and it finds a market almost immediately. It's one of those engines that it's a 3 litre, it has sort of the power that a lot of people are demanding, but it doesn't fall off the economy efficiency scale, which some of these sort of very large diesel engines can sometimes do. There's this sort of cross between diesel enthusiast and then car enthusiast, and you find that when you get to like the V8 diesel, you really have to sit a little bit more on a diesel enthusiast than you do a car enthusiast, and so that's why you find so few of them, and the Macan never gets a V8 diesel. Now, there's the turbo models, and if you're looking in this early generation and you want something, a little bit special, you don't mind higher running costs, you just want something that sort of stands out on the road and something that may have a little bit of long-term sort of memory for people who are looking around, say in 5 years' time, you want to be able to sell it on. Turbos, generally speaking, anything that's, Porsche and then something turbo, generally is desirable. That's just speaking generally. However, they're not that strong of a seller on the early Macans. In the first year, yeah, of course, they do get a lot out, especially to the enthusiast market and people that are sort of interested in this new car. But as sales years go on, it's not really the one a lot of people go for. In fact, it's the Macan S that really tempts people. And I think that's because if you're looking for sort of the perfect middle ground, so you want more power than a 2 litre if you had the 2 litre option available. You don't want the diesel because you're looking at lots of long-term ownership and you're thinking, well, that was one of the sort of engines picked out on the emissions scandal, although the Macan doesn't have the exact engine code that is sort of one of the worst offenders. But, you're sort of looking, you're thinking, don't really want to go diesel either. And the turbo is just a little bit more than you need. The 3 litre model, so it goes into the Macan S, twin turbo engine, more than powerful enough for many of you, especially if it's going to be a family vehicle. But the GTS, I said this on the Cayenne guide. GTS models with any Porsche GTS model, it's just usually when you sort of take the whole range and put it out in front of you, it usually is the pick. And it's because a lot of the time it's offering good power, reasonable fuel economy, but especially if you're looking in a Panamera, a Macan, a Cayenne, these things are considered. Unlike if you're just looking at a 911 Turbo S, then the enjoyment factor is probably going to sort of take over any mile per gallon or litre per 100 kilometres that you're considering. So really, this is where this sort of engine, it fits this nice little wedge between you have high performance, you go for the GTS, you've got really nice styling to go with it, it looks like something a little bit special on the road, and it's got performance to match it, but you haven't got the sort of more extreme running costs that go with the turbo model, mainly in fuel efficiency, in taxation, and in general running costs for servicing, etc., etc. So on the first generation, I would be looking at a GTS if you want to spend a bit more money and you're a bit of an enthusiast and you do enjoy a drive, because you're going to get a few of those bits that make that chassis really sort of come alive if you do like to sort of wiggle it down a country road on a weekend. If it's just, you would like a nice car, maybe you're looking at a Volkswagen Tiguan, Audi Q5, Lexus NX, Mercedes GLC, this sort of premium mid-size SUV, I would probably look at the 2 litre if you have it. I'd look at the turbo if you don't and you're sort of in the US or somewhere, and I'm just thinking of the sales figures there. The diesel is an option for those mainly in Europe, and if you can get your hands on it, and if you sort of don't mind that idea that it's going to be a little bit of a standout engine, the engine gets dropped once this car moves into its E2, which we'll talk about in just a second, and so it's sort of that thing, it sort of sticks out. Good engine, good to drive, but it's not going to be as enjoyable as having a 3 litre petrol. And fuel efficiency wise, the 2 litre, mixing that with the fact that you can sort of get that 2 litre worked on anywhere, and with 2 less cylinders, it is going to be just cheaper to own. from a reliability and from a maintenance standpoint, I'd probably edge my way over towards the 2 litre if you're looking for more of the budget buy, say, and then 3 litre in a GTS if you're a bit more of an enthusiast. But of course, the turbo is there for those of you that just want that thrust in the back and don't worry too much about passengers complaining at you if you've got your foot to the floor. From there, we go to the second generation. This is the E2 model. And here the lineup really slims down. Basically, there's a 2 litre, there's a 3 litre, and then there's the 2.9, which goes into the turbo models. Now, looking at just a quick overview here, really what the brand did was say, we know there's some people that want these cars, they like the car, and on the facelift model here, or the E2, they've decided to add in a lot of things that people were demanding from the first generation and do a lot of key updates here. There's a lot of sort of infotainment, and the way things are set up does just step it up that little bit more. You know, competition around the car had increased. Some vehicles had been completely refreshed. And so the brand had to do something here. And so they did step up to the plate, to be fair. And they realised that while there was a large number of customers that did want high power models, the dominant number of customers that they were finding across markets were people that want something well priced, something that was competitive from a performance standpoint, but it didn't have to, you know, put the wind in their hair sort of thing. It didn't have to blow their socks off. It just had to perform quite nicely against the competition. And so here, again, the 2 litre becomes overly competitive. You know, they really do make it a great engine, good power. We're looking at 250 horsepower here. That's about 100 horsepower shy of the S model that gets the 3 litre engine. And so you do have to make a decision there whether the extra 2 cylinders and 100 horsepower is worth it for you. Some of you won't have the 2 litre model, unfortunately, and so you'll start at the S model. But the S model here, I think it takes a step back. The main reason for that is because you've only got the 4 sort of engine variations. So the 2 litre, 3 litre, and then the 2.9, and the 2.9 goes in the GTS, goes in the turbo. It sort of leaves the 3 litre in an odd place. Essentially, if you want a 3 litre, what you're looking at is the middle ground between high efficiency, good power, and high demand, and enthusiast market. And because of that, it gets a little bit squeezed in this generation. And I think it'll be harder for you to find on the used market something that will be sort of, you know, wide in range and easy for you to sort of say no to one because it's the wrong colour, or no to another because of the condition. You know, you're just narrowing your choices down compared to the 2 litre. Now, this is a little bit market dependent. I think if you're in the US, then probably the 3 litre is still a dominant engine because fuel economy, and there's a general acceptance of larger engines over in the US. But I think the 2.9, it starts to steal a lot of the buyers. So you're only stepping up in the GTS another sort of 25-30 horsepower over what you are in the S. But it's the way the engine delivers the power, and it's the full package that you get with it. Now, yeah, okay, turbo takes it even further. You add sort of about 60 horsepower performance package with it, and a lot of sort of key elements of the car are really ramped up to make it something that is performance orientated. However, looking at the sales, you can tell the brand knew that this was the one that was just for enthusiasts. It was possibly someone who had, say, a GT3 at home and wanted something fast to go around in day to day when, say, the weather wasn't right for their GT3. Those were people who are buying Macan turbos, and that might be you, and that's just absolutely great, you know, that's fine. But I think for the majority of you, if you can get into the GTS model again, you get the engine that's gone into the turbo, but with slightly less horsepower, but with really good chassis dynamics. And so you kind of fit into a nice sort of middle ground between where the 2 litre starts off, where the turbo takes you on the extreme end, and, you know, that enthusiast really looks good, has the styling a lot of people will want, and has the performance to match it. You know, it will easily sort of run away from a 2 litre model. This is where I say the 3 litre is a little bit more difficult for me to fit in here. Yes, nicer specification than the base model. However, some people, because the 2 litre was generally bought by customers, there are some more lease buyers around here, so possibly specification won't be quite as nice. If you're someone that loves to have the big spec sheet, then yeah, possibly the S will be the one to go for. From a reliability standpoint, it's quite remarkable. So I talked about in the first generation, you know, the costs you'd be facing. The diesel engine, it steps slightly back in reliability, mainly because of Michelin's equipment. The turbo, it steps slightly off on reliability just because of all the complexity around it. When you come into this second generation, really what you're talking about is a very well understood 2-litre engine and a 2.9 that has, I think in its very first year, had a few teething issues, but after that, really well understood and seems to perform fantastically for people. The same goes for the 3-litre. These engines were reasonably well understood. They hadn't been around for ages, but they'd been around long enough by the time they get into the Macan that they can sort of perform without sort of needing, say, a year or two to really sort of make sure that there aren't things that missed out on the testing. So from my view, if you're looking here, I think you can go for any year, 19, 20, 21. Those are the only years you'll have this E2 generation. In fact, for many of you, it will be more like 20 and 21 than anything else. So from there, what have we got? The E3, the final facelift. And this is a bit of an odd one. I think I know exactly why this model exists, and we'll go into that. But I should probably, let's just talk about the engines first off on this E3. And the reason I'll talk about this one just that little bit more is because of where the brand is going. And of course, we know that the latest Macan is all electric. So if you don't want an electric Macan, this E3, that's your last chance. And so kind of going along with what I've said so far, what you're left with now is just 2 engine options, 2.9, 2-litre. To be honest, I could kind of see that coming. The way the brand has worked and the way demand has, you've started off with this broader base, and it's been very clear from the sales years that there is really 2 engines that people are choosing more than anything else. The turbo model disappears, and instead you have a range-topping GTS. Now, we'll start off with the T and the base model. Okay, these both have 2-litre engines, a few horsepower between them, but at this point, really, it makes it difficult to recommend the higher power entries, only because if you're looking on the used market and you're thinking to yourself, well, I want something that, you know, performs well, but this is still going to be somewhat of a family car. It's not going to be a sports car just for you to drive. You're now up at sort of 260 horsepower. It's not the most encouraging of noises, but to be fair, 2.9, it does have to get muted, especially in Europe because of new regulations coming through. So, you know, I'm an enthusiast. I'm always going to tell you to buy the biggest engine, the fastest one, and everything else. I pull myself in when we come to these, when it comes to these generation videos, to try and sort of recommend the things that I think most of you will enjoy. And having driven a T model, I think the Macan T, it found the market. Like, it almost was able, at that point where Porsche said, well, yeah, we realise what everyone now wants, and it's the T. And the T comes in with high specification, or higher specification than the base model, leaves a little bit of headroom for the GTS model to be ahead of it, and the S model, but it really sort of shows what the brand is able to offer at a challenging price point, but something that will be attractive going forward. Now, there's no hybrid, and I think it's a little bit of a shame because I could kind of see that what the T could have been was some sort of plug-in hybrid here, and they could have had, the T could have been a base model, a hybrid could have been one ahead of it, and then an S and a GTS. That would make more sense to me, but obviously they made their decision on how they were going to market the brand and how they could see things going forward. So the T here, it's the pick for me, which is tough because the one I really want to say is the GTS. Now the GTS is a near full 2 seconds faster to 60 than the base Macan. I am aware, by the way, I should just mention, I keep saying T and then base, and some of you will be a bit confused about that. So there's the 2 engine options, and for some markets you will have a base model, a T, which is basically higher trim of the base specification, but with the same engine, and then the S and the GTS. So for some of you, we're sort of splitting it between, there's 2 2-litres over here, and then 2 2.9s. For some of you, there is just the T, and then the 2.9s. It really depends on what the demand was like in your particular market, and how the company thought they would be able to sort of export to those markets to make the most effective sales happen. And so for some of you, the base is just completely skipped. I think actually most countries outside of Europe just get the base model completely skipped straight into the T. It's just not surprising to me. I think the T makes a really good argument for itself. But The GTS, as I say, it's much faster than the base model. It's about 1.5 seconds faster than the T. And here is where you see the brand's able to sort of just implement aspects into the car that people have been demanding for a couple of generations. They want something that drives fast, but they are clearly not interested in the high horsepower. This you can see in the sales years. The turbo model before that, it was kind of like the niche model. I think if you look at the 911 range, for example, and you have like the Carrera, and you have GTS models, and you have the turbo, and you have GT3, GT2, all that sort of stuff. And then you'll have, the Carrera T and all the special variations of it. The turbo, base turbo, or turbo, and turbo S, if we put them over in a corner, they still have buyers. They still have people that had the previous generation turbo that turn up and they want the new one. And that just doesn't happen with the Macan. Most people that buy the early turbo don't go to repeat that purchase, and some of them go into GTS models. And I think that's why we have the GTS in the end and not the turbo variation. For some of you who found this video and you've sort of seen that the new one is just electric, but you can still buy this one, I think you'll be happy with the T. What has happened in the last few years of the car market is that people have got sort of quite lost on figures. So figures are thrown out, 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. And you kind of forget that what you're going to do, especially in a Macan, most of the time is drive it to work, to shops, to sort of recreational areas, to sort of sports areas, whatever you do in your spare time. You're not going to be taking it to the track. The GTS is for those people that probably aren't going to take it to a track, but they will take it instead of their sports car to sort of the country lanes or the back roads or the mountains or wherever they have around them all year round, because either inclement weather stops them taking their sports car, or because they don't have the space for 2 cars on the driveway. They don't want a big SUV. They have to have the family car, but they can't have a sports car next to it. And so the Macan is the sort of perfect middle ground, if you like. And with the GTS, you can tell that the same people that work on the Boxster and Cayman or the 718, people that work on the GT 911s, and the people that work on sort of the top spec Cayennes, they do come over and have a bit of work and spend a bit of time on the GTS model of the Macan and give it some of their attention. And you can kind of feel that in the way it drives. So if you're that buyer, then GTS. For the rest of you though, I'm not saying you have to skip the S. I just think, you still get the 2.9 in the S, and it's still a powerful option. And there were quite a few good deals on the S model, but I just think the T makes such a good argument for itself in this last generation, especially if you just want a nice vehicle that has power but has high efficiency to go with it. I don't think you're going to feel that shortchanged, if I'm honest. So there's the E1, E2, E3, and it's a real strange one, this, as I say, because we're still able to buy new Macans that are the old car. And the fact that it was a 10-year-old design in 2024, or at least a 10-year-old shell, just shows how the car market is kind of moving forward. No hybrid option, unfortunately. That would probably be, if there was, say, an S model with a hybrid, and again, not quite sure they didn't do it, but it would have made more sense to me to have a T that could have been a hybrid or an S hybrid, and then a GTS off to the side. So that way you kind of meet your enthusiast buyer, your person that's not too interested in the engine but is interested in the car itself, and then the person that wants the best of both worlds in the middle, and maybe they want some of that electric range for whatever reason it may be, whether they live in a city or regulators sort of demand it. So yeah, that's where we are with the Macan. I hope the video's helped. As I say, I'll do a quick run through the E1 generation. You can look at the diesel. 2 litre though would probably be a pick for the entry, and then up into the turbo or the GTS really, but turbo just for the fact that you're not going to have another turbo. For those of you that have the 4-cylinder on that first E1, and if you're thinking, well, you're a big fan of the brand and you don't want something that isn't special. Well, and I say this in the buyer's guide, the Macan 4-cylinder is the first 4-cylinder Porsche model for a couple of generations. I think it's the 968. I could be wrong in that. If it's wrong, then I'll put a thing up. But I think it's 968 that was before that was 2 litre. So it's a few decades So you have the first one. The 718 then goes into a 4-cylinder, but the Macan beats it to it. There's a little bit of history there to have that first introductory into 4-cylinders as the brand then brings more and more of them in. For the rest of you in the middle generation, I think the middle one's a little bit awkward, the E2. It kind of sits at this point where you can tell the brand wanted to do a facelift. And if I'm honest, I think if they had been more confident in the EV model selling well, they probably wouldn't have done the second facelift, or at least they would have left it 1 year, done a bigger facelift in 2020, and we would only have a first and a second variation of this chassis. Clearly the market wasn't going in that direction, and so they made the right decision in doing an E1, E2, E3, but it leaves the E2 in this odd space where for most of you it will be, let's say, 2 years, maximum 3 years that's on sale, unlike the first one, which gets pretty much a full 5 years of production, and the last one, which who knows how that long go on for. It's had 3 years so far. If the demand stays there, Porsche said they'll keep selling it in any market that has the demand. And so I think we could at least see another year, probably more like 2 years of that vehicle around. So yeah, the E2 sits in an odd sort of middle ground zone. If I was looking at it, GTS, and I say in the last generation, I really want to say the GTS because that's the enthusiast buy. But I think the T makes such a good argument for itself. I would at least have a drive of one if you're looking at those, the newer generation, the sort of 2021 onwards. I'd at least have a drive of a T. If you don't like it, that's fine. As I say, the S and the GTS are there. But the T, it just makes such a good argument for itself. It's worth having a go in. I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you did, consider subscribing. Otherwise, have a very nice day, and I shall see you next time.